All right, everybody, good evening and welcome to Oregon State University's Virtual Science Pub for tonight on July 13th, 2020. We've got a great program for you tonight and we are excited to present to you OSU's own Christopher Stout. But before we get to that, we're going to get to some introductions. We're going to go over the audience participation. Wow, it's Monday night. Portion of the show tonight. For those of you that have not joined us before, many of you are going through the YouTube live feed or the Facebook feed. You are more than welcome, if you're users of those, to go ahead and put questions during the question and answer portion of our presentation tonight directly in the chat. If you do not want to log in with that, you can use our Mentimeter app. All you're going to need to do is go through www.menti.com. And what you're going to do is you're going to get a login page and it's going to simply ask you for an event code. That event code for tonight is going to be 40-57-67. So that's 40-57-67. First half of the presentation tonight is going to be a presentation from Christopher. Second half is going to be a Q&A panel. If by chance we're not able to get to everybody's questions, and we have about 500 people registered for tonight, so it's an amazing crowd. If we can't get to them all, you are able to just email us at events@OSU-Cascades.edu. Again, that's events@OSU-Cascades.edu, and we will hopefully get your questions answered for you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Christopher Stout is an associate professor in the School of Public Policy at Oregon State University. He's the author of a number of pieces related to tonight's topic, including Bringing Race Back In, Black Politicians, Deracialization, and Voting Behavior in the Age of Obama, and The Case for Identity Politics, Polarization, Demographic Change, and Racial Appeals. Christopher teaches courses on the American political system, as well as presidential and congressional politics. And Chris, on behalf of the audience tonight, I'd like to thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Nathan, for having me, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I'm pretty excited to share some of this, talk about this topic, and particularly why Black Lives Matter has made such a big impact in American politics. I think one of the things that's interested me about the Black Lives Matter movement is why it happened now and not in the past. And this kind of relates to my forthcoming book, The Case for Identity Politics, where I look at how the political conditions make discussions about race more palatable now than it's been in the past. And so I'm going to start by showing two videos. These videos might be graphic. They have to do with police brutality. So if this is something that would be alarming or something you'd wish not to see, my warning now is to look away. So I'm going to show two videos quickly and then discuss this. I don't know if we can go to the next slide, Nathan, whenever you're ready.
As a week of pretrial motions ended today in the case of the 4 Los Angeles policemen already indicted in the Rodney King beating, the county grand jury signaled that will be the extent of the criminal case. 17 other so-called police bystanders at the beating scene will not be indicted, a development noted with frustration by the...
Next slide.
Floyd. We do see Officer Chauvin pull up to the scene with his colleague, and behind the vehicle's open door, we can make out what seems to be a struggle. Whatever was happening between Floyd and the officers at that very moment caught the attention of this passerby who stops to watch. 2 minutes later, a witness standing on Chicago Avenue captures part of the scene unfolding behind the squad car. One officer looks over as 3 of his colleagues restrain Floyd, who is lying face down on the ground in handcuffs. We don't know how Floyd ended up on the ground. One officer is pressing his knee into Floyd's neck, which we see clearly in this video, taken only seconds later by another witness standing in front of the grocery store. She captured the next 10 minutes of his deadly arrest, up until he is taken away in an ambulance.
Okay, so those are two videos, obviously horrifying and hard to watch. But there are things that have become pretty prevalent in America over the last 30 years. But we're just seeing a movement in terms of a movement against police brutality that's sustainable. So there's always been a movement, but one that's captured America's attention and actually has led to change really hasn't happened until the last 5 years. And here's another graph just showing that, so we don't have really fantastic data on police brutality, in large part because that is not recorded. That's one of the things that Congress is trying to address now. But we do have some information on justifiable homicides, which is collected by the FBI. And these are basically police shootings that are justifiable over time. And they're kind of a good proxy for police brutality. And we can see during the period of Rodney King, those numbers were actually pretty high, higher than they are now, but there has been an uptick. And so one of the things that I'm interested in, I guess we go to the next slide, Nathan, and I guess what I'll talk about tonight a little bit is why did the Black Lives Matter movement happen now and did not happen earlier, right? So there's long been grievances about police brutality. There's long been a frustration about racial inequality, but it really seems to have occurred after 2014 with the start of the Black Lives Matter movement and seems to be continuing today into 2020. So I'll talk about the political and social context, which may have given rise to the Black Lives Matter movement. And then I'll talk about the impact, because I think the Black Lives Matter movement has had a substantial impact on American politics and also society overall. And I'll talk about why I think that's the case and give some examples of where the movement has had an impact. Then I'll briefly conclude by discussing what the future of the movement looks like. Go to the next slide. So I think the story of Black Lives Matter really starts with the election of Barack Obama in 2008. Barack Obama's election to the White House is a watershed moment in American history. In a country where African Americans weren't given the right to vote for the first 100 years of the nation's existence, roughly, the election of Barack Obama represents a real transformation in racial politics. And it goes over a long-standing belief amongst African Americans and whites that one of the results of the civil rights movement was that race no longer mattered. If someone like Barack Obama, who was raised by a single parent, could achieve success, could be elected the highest office in the land, then anybody could. And we could no longer talk about racial discrimination as being a problem. He is the pinnacle of what it means to live in a post-racial society. And so for many people, this leads to a lot of optimism, which was, I think, already existed, right? So if there were questions about racial discrimination in the past, people would often say, well, that's a one-off case. That's not a prevalent, systematic problem. And Barack Obama is evidence of this, that if racial discrimination was still a large barrier, then someone like Barack Obama wouldn't be elected. And so this increased optimism is one that wasn't just seen amongst whites, it was also seen among African Americans. Nathan, we go to the next slide. Here's Cornell Belcher, who's a political pundit. He's on numerous morning shows, he's often on Meet the Press and ABC's This Week. He was a pollster for Barack Obama. And in 2009, in an interview, he says, "I'm the new black politics. The people I work with are the new black politics. We don't carry around that history. We see the world through a post-civil rights eyes." Can we go to the next slide? Here's other people quoted in a book by Ellis Coase, who's a journalist, and he interviewed numerous African Americans, and they would talk about their experiences now. And in the book, the main goal of this book was to argue that the new generation, the post-civil rights generation of African Americans, don't see the world through a racial lens the way that their parents did, and that they're no longer really worried about racial discrimination like their parents. So here's a couple of quotes that feed into this idea that we've reached a post-racial society and maybe shouldn't be focusing so much on racial discrimination. If an African American can be elected president to the United States, I don't think there's anything in this country we can't do. Another quote says, "For people of my generation, the biggest challenge is to adapt yourself to the norm. If you're willing to completely assimilate, people overlook that you're a minority." So again, this goes to the idea that if there are instances of racial discrimination, these are case specific. And if you work hard enough, then you don't really have to worry about racial discrimination. And so Black optimism was higher in the 1990s and 2000s during a period of time where you might have seen the Rodney King riots lead to a spark in the movement. And so there wasn't the same pressure for that movement, nor an appetite from the general public. The other thing I wanted to note here is that not only was Black optimism high in the 1990s and early 2000s, but it grows significantly in the first years of Barack Obama's election. So now people are really optimistic about the future. Barack Obama's president, we're going to see a real end to racial discrimination. And as many of us know, when you're really optimistic about something, if your expectations aren't met, it leads to more frustration than if you're already pessimistic, right? So if I am optimistic that the Oregon State Beavers are going to win a football game and they lose, then I'm more crushed than if I think they're going to lose and then they ultimately lose, which they're hopefully on the up and up. So we'll all be more optimistic. Yeah, the next slide, Nathan.
My message to the Tea Party is this.
The NAACP points to the racial epithets allegedly hurled at black members of Congress by Tea Party members during the healthcare debate, and to the racist signs that critics say they've spotted at Tea Party events to support its conclusion that the Tea Party movement is a threat to the pursuit of human rights, justice, and equality for all. At the group's annual meeting in Kansas City, the resolution had plenty of support.
When we turn on the television and we see posters and flyers that send very frightening messages to our community, we have to address it.
Next slide. Okay, so with this growing optimism from the public, a lot of this becomes shattered after Barack Obama's election to the White House. Barack Obama's elected. There's this expectation that he's going to work with the other side. He meets with members of the Republican Party, and he can't seem to get footing and make compromises. And then you have a social movement that occurs around the same time. This is known as the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party movement's goal ostensibly was to address the growing deficit in the United States, but they were largely perceived as having a lot of racial animus and being driven by racial resentment toward African Americans. So regardless of what their actual goal was, the perception in most public opinion polls was that they were driven by racial animus toward Barack Obama and changing demographics to the nation. There's a really fantastic book by Christopher Parker and Matt Barretto talking about the Tea Party movement. I think it's Change They Can't Believe In. And they go through numerous instances where they show that the public viewed the Tea Party as being motivated by racial animus. So the Tea Party kind of sheds light to most Americans who believe that we've achieved a post-racial society, that maybe this wasn't the case. And so at the same time that expectations are high, the cognitive dissonance of then seeing examples of racism in the United States or perceiving that a movement's driven by racism and a widespread movement kind of starts to shatter this belief. And then once the Tea Party gets in, the Tea Party does extremely well, and Tea Party based politicians do really well in the 2010 midterm elections, both in the federal government and in numerous state governments. And as they start to take over numerous states, they start to impose laws which are seen as disenfranchising African Americans. The most notable of these probably is voter identification laws that went up across the country. And there's some research by Zoltan Heinel and his colleagues which show that these laws disproportionately disenfranchise African Americans and Latinx individuals. And so the belief is that things are getting better, but now you're seeing evidence of things getting worse. And pretty soon after the Tea Party's elected, you have a Supreme Court case, Shelby County versus Holder, which strikes back the most important sections of the Voting Rights Act. And as soon as that happens, you start to see greater efforts at political disenfranchisement, including the closing of polls in numerous areas that are predominantly African American or Latinx, greater use of voter identification laws, and increased barriers to registration and voting. And so now, again, this idea things are getting better, but you're seeing evidence that things are getting worse. So the higher levels of expectations with the reality of, or the feeling that things aren't really progressing, and that we're moving closer to the pre-civil rights era, leads to growing frustration amongst, I think, African Americans, but also liberal whites and Latinx individuals. So now you have a context where it takes a spark, and a spark happens that can start a movement. And the spark happens slowly. In 2012, there's a pretty high-profile case in which a self-appointed night watchman, George Zimmerman, tracks down a kid, Trayvon Martin, who he believes is up to no good for some reason, calls him a thug, and the police that he's speaking to say, "Don't follow this kid, leave him alone." He follows him an altercation ensues, and then Trayvon Martin ends up dead. George Zimmerman is ultimately charged, but then acquitted. The night that he's acquitted, 3 Black women start a hashtag on Twitter known as Black Lives Matter. Can I go to the next slide, Nathan? And this hashtag ultimately becomes a larger organization, which is focused on many goals. The one that it's most known for, of course, is addressing police brutality and making sure that brutality against people of color are prosecuted. So there are some consequences to this. So George Zimmerman's acquitted in July 13 of 2013. And this graph here basically shows the number of tweets using the hashtag Black Lives Matter. One of the things that's pretty interesting about this graph is the start of the movement is with Trayvon Martin, but it doesn't really gain significance or get a lot of attention until a shooting in August of 2014. And this is the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. This is where you see the movement slow. During this period of time between 2013 and 2014, Black Lives Matter is used the hashtag sparingly, but the organization around this is starting to grow. So there's a website, there's information and goals that the group wants to put out so that it's in kind of a place once the Michael Brown shooting occurs, that you start to see a growing interest in Black Lives Matter. And so between August 2014 and then really December 2014, you start to, for the first time, see a large growth in the use of Black Lives Matter on Twitter. And it grows really during the Ferguson, Missouri, when Darren Wilson, the person who shot Michael Brown, is acquitted. And then over the course of the next couple of years, we start to see videos like Rodney King weekly, right? There was a period of time where Rodney King it was just so egregious. You couldn't believe that something like that would occur. And then we see it a lot, right? We see it with Walter Scott in South Carolina, a man who's shot in his back by a police officer. We see a child, Tamir Rice, shot by a police officer who doesn't even appear to get out of his car before he shoots Tamir Rice. And so we start to see a lot of these videos. In July of 2016, it starts to grow again because July of 2016, I think this graph is slightly off because they're saying it's in part driven by the 5 police officers killed during a protest, but that also coincides with the period of time where Philando Castile is shot in Minnesota, and then also Alton Sterling is killed in Louisiana. And this is really the height of this movement, is in July of 2016 before the presidential election. And then there's a lull between 2017, 2018, and it stops here. I don't know if I have, can we go to the next slide, Nathan? I don't know if I kept this in. Hope I didn't. I think I have this at some point in the presentation, but it's further down, and I'll get to it when I get to it. But there's been a large increase again with Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, and that happened this year. Okay, so the Black Lives Matter movement is one of the largest in recent history. There's some estimates that up to 26 million people have been involved in a protest, and that might not seem like an extremely high number, but the largest protests before were the women's marches of 2017 and 2018, and those marches had about 10 million based off some estimates. So it's a really large movement, and it has changed American politics in numerous ways, and I'll talk about that. The first is recognition and greater discussion of race. I'll preface this video quickly by saying, well, actually, can I play the video, Nathan, and then I'll talk about it?
So part of what technology allows us to see now is the terrible toll that racism and discrimination and hate takes on families and communities. But that's part of how we learn and how we get better. We don't benefit from pretending that racism doesn't exist and hate doesn't exist. We don't benefit from not talking about it. The fact that these things are being surfaced means we can solve them.
The other big question a lot of our viewers have is, has race relations gotten better or worse since you have been in office?
I think that in some ways, like everything else, it's gotten better, and in some ways, I think we have surfaced that were already there. but are getting more attention.
Okay, so when Barack Obama was leaving the White House in 2016, this isn't this interview, but this gives the gist. He was on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and George asked him, are things getting better, right? Are race relations better now than before? And he said, oh, they're better. And then George Stephanopoulos looks confused, like who would say that things are better in 2016 than they were in 2008? You saw the rise of the Tea Party, you see the rise of Black Lives Matter. It seems like there's more racial discord now than in the past. And when further probed on the question, Barack Obama said, look, it's better now because we're not ignoring that racism isn't a problem or that racial discrimination isn't a problem. And that's really the first step to making change. And so one of the reasons why something like Rodney King might not have led to a spark or a sustained social movement was the belief amongst most people that racism was really a thing that people fought against in the 1950s and 1960s. And the civil rights movement kind of addressed that problem, and that problem's gone. And so even if racial discrimination is happening, people aren't recognizing it. And so if you don't recognize the problem, then you're not going to be apt to fix that problem. Can you go to the next slide, Nathan? Oh, so this isn't the graph I was thinking about earlier, but here's a graph showing that people became more interested in the idea of racism after 2014, 2015, and 2016. So this is Google trend searches, which is basically the number of searches on Google, which have to do with terms about racism. So racial bias, racism. And so it's people seeking out information on racism in the United States. And it's focused only on the United States. And we can see that as a result of Black Lives, there's a real lull in the early Obama years. In fact, in 2011 is when you get to a really the lowest point. But starting in 2013 and then grows pretty significantly going into 2015 and 2016, there's way more public interest around the idea of racial discrimination. Go to the next slide. And then here's just another graph. Pew Research did a poll, a survey of Americans between June 4th of this year. And they found that basically 7 in 10 people have had conversations about race or racial equality in the last couple of months. Certainly without the Black Lives Matter movement, there wouldn't be this focus on George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Sean Reed, et cetera. And people would not be having these conversations, right? And so I've done a lot of research on this, and I've shown like really 2014 is the critical marker, right? So when people are starting to pay attention to Black Lives Matter, people become much more interested in racial discrimination as a topic. And this is happening across the United States, and it's growing even more now in 2020. The recognition of racial discrimination really is the first step to decreasing racial prejudice. So there's a pretty cool study about the NBA. I'm a big sports fan. That there was a study that came out that showed that referees were much more likely to call African-American players for fouls and more likely to give them technical fouls for the same offenses. This information came out. The referees were told this information, and then looking at a period 5 years after that information became public, those disparities disappeared. And this works, and there's a lot of psychological work that shows that this matters. When people have a recognition of something, they're much more likely to question their motives before they make a decision, right? So if I'm a referee and I'm calling a foul on one person, I'm much more likely to question, is that driven by my racial biases? And that doesn't happen unless you confront the possibility that there might be some underlying racial biases occurring. So one of the things that Black Lives Matter has done is increase interest in racial discrimination, which is really the first step in addressing racial prejudice. Go to the next slide. And so not only, so I made the argument, of course, that if you're more cognizant of it, it's going to lead to lower levels of racism. And there's evidence of this, right? So after Black Lives Matter, you start to see a large decrease in the amount of racism amongst different groups of people. This graph is showing basically the same individuals, and they're asked questions about whether stereotypes about African Americans and Latinx individuals. Do you think these people are lazy? Do you think these people are trustworthy? Do you think these people are treated fairly? Things like this. And so this study done by Daniel Hopkins and Samantha Washington asked these same people, the 537 whites, over between 2008 and 2018, and they noticed that discrimination had fallen significantly after 2016, and much lower than it was even in 2013 before the start of the Black Lives Matter movement. You go to the next slide. In some of my own research, I find something similar. So there's some measure of racial resentment. There's a measure that social scientists use to measure levels of racism, and it's called racial resentment. This basically looks at, again, stereotypes about African Americans. And it's kind of a good, like if you ask people, are you racist? No one's going to say yeah, or very few people are going to say, yeah, I'm racist. But you can kind of measure anti-Black attitudes by asking a series of questions about, well, what do you think about African Americans? Do you think that slavery has had a long-lasting impact on their ability to succeed in the United States? Do you think that they're like other immigrant groups like Irish Americans, Italian Americans, in that if they work hard enough, they can succeed? And this scale is used to measure levels of underlying racism. The dark line here, the darkest line here is for Democrats. And you can see between 2012 and 2016 that there was a sharp decrease in the amount of levels of racism amongst white Democrats during that period of time. And even independents too were at their lowest point after the Black Lives Matter movement. Republicans decreased in their levels of racism between 2012 and 2016, but it's still much higher than it was in the early 1990s. But overall, you do see a decrease in racial resentment amongst these groups. So again, Black Lives Matter not only leads to greater recognition, but it's at least associated with changes in racial attitudes toward African Americans. Go to the next slide, Nick. BLM also has been tied to changes in support for racial policies, which may go hand in hand with this greater recognition of racial discrimination as being a problem. I don't have this graph here, but I should mention this for African Americans and Latinos as well. This is particularly true for African Americans, that African Americans during the 1980s had kind of a higher sense of racial consciousness or racial linked faith. This belief that my race matters to me and that plays a large role in my individual outcomes in life. In the 1990s and 2000s, this basically decreases to its lowest point. And then after the Black Lives Matter movement, it grows to its highest point as been measured in the last 50 years. So another thing that Black Lives Matter has done is it's led African Americans to realize that race is still an issue. So once you start to think that racial discrimination is a problem, most people want to solve this level of inequality, right? So if there is a problem, most people want to fix that problem. And we can see evidence of this if we start to look at changes in support for policies. So liberal whites and Blacks have become much more supportive for explicitly and implicitly racial policies. So for example, Blacks and particularly Democratic whites have become much more supportive of affirmative action in 2016 and beyond than they had been at any point in the last 40 years. The same group of individuals have become much more supportive of voting rights and protections for voting rights and a reinstatement of the Voting Rights Act than they've been in any time in recent history. And there's been greater support for police oversight. The other thing that, in terms of racial policy, is that voters tend to want candidates who take racially liberal stances on policies. And this is something that you wouldn't see in the past, right? I guess I'll talk about that. I think I talk about that on the next slide. Can I go to the next slide, Nathan? I think I have a graph first and then I'll go to that. Okay, so this is also a graph here that shows that people think that percent of Americans who agree that more needs to change to give Black equal rights. So again, there's this recognition of prejudice, but there's a greater recognition that things need to change. And you can see that the biggest jump that occurs here is after 2014, between 2014 and 2015. And again, this is the period where Black Lives Matter is starting to become extremely important. And this is true for all groups, right? Almost 8 in 10 Democrats think that things need to change to give African Americans equal rights. Close to a majority of, these are whites only, sorry. White independents believe things need to change to give Black equal rights. And even there's a large growth in even white Republicans who think things need to change to give Blacks equal rights. So you're seeing a change in people's attitudes around racial policy across the board, not just amongst white Democrats and liberals, but it's most pronounced amongst that group. Go to the next slide, Nick. Okay, so my last point of the slide before this was that voters want politicians to take positions on racial politics. And this was not the case until the Black Lives Matter movement. And we can kind of see this when we look at Barack Obama's response to Trayvon Martin. So when Trayvon Martin was killed in 2012, there was a national outcry, and Barack Obama was much more cautious about how he should weigh in on this particular issue. So he was much slower, more methodical. I think there's probably a lot of internal polling done about how it would look for an African-American president to come out and talk about police brutality. Would it turn off certain voters? And ultimately he does come out and he gives a really good speech about what happened, but he's really slow to respond, and people criticized him for doing this. And then even when he did it, there were questions about whether or not that was good politics or not. In 2016, after Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were shot and killed, Hillary Clinton was quick to respond, right? So the Black Lives Matter movement made it acceptable for politicians to respond. I would be surprised if they did the same. They might have done the same internal polling, but the response was much quicker. And we saw the same thing with Biden in 2020. And this isn't just true for these politicians who are black and white. I will say black politicians in general are much quicker to respond to these shootings. So if we look at members of Congress, and I've done research, this is where some of my research is, black members of Congress are much quicker to speak out, right? So after Michael Brown is killed in Ferguson, Missouri, then black representatives are the first to speak out. White representatives don't really talk about it. That's changed. I looked at the press releases around George Floyd, and while there was a wide disparity of blacks and whites speaking out around Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson, Missouri, almost that disparity has disappeared. Numerous whites and African Americans came out, and these are elected officials, condemning the murder of George Floyd. And so we're seeing a change in the behavior of politicians to where they're becoming more proactive, and they're rewarded, I think, electorally for doing so, because voters want more progressive politicians. I show this picture here that this is becoming much more widespread, right? So politicians want to get reelected, right? That's the goal of any politician, is to win elected office, and of course to make change once you do so. But the first step is to get elected. So politicians are really vote-minded in a lot of the decisions that they make, and they're vote maximizers. As public opinion has changed about racial policies, then politicians feel more compelled to speak out in a way that they haven't in the past. And this is true of all politicians. Here's a picture of Mitt Romney, who was the 2012 Republican nominee for president. He's marching with the Black Lives Matter protesters. When I've looked at responses to Black Lives Matter issues that are important to Black Lives Matter before 2016, no Republicans were speaking out. Now you see even Republicans speaking out on these particular issues. Romney's not the only one. Others like Ben Sass have introduced bills to make Juneteenth a national holiday. So it does seem like Black Lives Matter has changed the behavior of politicians as well. And I will say it's not just talk, right? There's numerous cities around the country who have turned this talk into action, right? So New York City, the mayor de Blasio has taken some funds that would have gone to the police department and reallocated those to social services. Numerous cities have put bans on chokeholds. The city of Louisville created Breonna's Law, named after Breonna Taylor, which forbids no-knock warrants. The city of Minneapolis has overhauled their police force. Congress, at least the House, has passed laws to make dash cams required for police officers and body cameras as well. And one of the things is to create a database for police brutality so we can know how prevalent or systematic that problem is. So Black Lives Matter has not just changed our attitudes, our behaviors, it is actually leading to some policy changes. Okay, the next slide, Nathan. Okay, so what happens next? In the short term, this partially depends on the result of the 2020 election. We can see this happening now. There's two bills, a bill in the House and in the U.S. Senate, which are addressing police brutality. The bill in the House, which is majority Democrat, tends to go a lot further in having actual repercussions for some of the, so there's punishments for poor actors, whereas the bill in the Senate tends to focus more on information collecting rather than punishment for police brutality. So there's some debate about that. If Democrats win back the Senate, which isn't an impossibility, then you might start to see more federal legislation. But this also matters at the local level, right? How numerous state houses turn out will influence whether or not states, how states address some of the goals of Black Lives Matter. And so what happens next will depend, at least in the short term, what happens in the 2020 election. Should Democrats regain the White House, regain the U.S. Senate, and hold on to the U.S. House, then it's likely that you'll see a lot of federal policies addressing some of the goals of Black Lives Matter be instituted. And we can see this in part, or at least a lot of policies addressing racial inequality. H.R. 1, the first bill that the Democrats put out once they took over the House after the 2018 elections, was addressing voting rights issues. I think one of the things that's interesting about this social movement is it different, right? We've seen social movements around race in the past. We saw the abolitionist movement early on in American history between the 1830s and really the 1870s. We've seen the civil rights movement probably from the turn of the century all the way up until the early 1970s. And all these movements have made significant progress, right? So the abolitionist movement got 3 amendments to the US Constitution, which ended slavery and gave Black men the right to vote, and also created equality under the law in some ways. The Civil Rights Act also had really meaningful policies in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and numerous other policies which addressed poverty, which African Americans are disproportionately in poverty. But all of these movements saw advancement and then basically retrenchment, right? The abolitionist movement in slavery, but by 1890, you started to see Blacks return to a condition that's really close to slavery with sharecropping. The Civil Rights Act addresses some types of inequality, but those inequalities start to grow again in the 90s. So whether or not Black Lives Matter will have meaningful change, it'll be interesting to see. Obviously, racial attitudes have changed now more than they have in the past, or at least what we can tell. We don't have good public polling in the 1830s. The other thing is that there's demographic change in the nation, right? There will be no group which is the majority of the population after 2040, 2044. And so it's possible that this movement has a much more sustained impact. But I think regardless of what happens next, it's hard to deny that Black Lives Matter has changed the course of American history, particularly with regards to racial politics. So I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much. I look forward to it.
Perfect. And I'm going to go through, let's stop share the presentation right now. Get a couple of these. We'll start off with first question. What do you think accounts for, I guess, the quote unquote lull in the Black Lives Matter movement between 2016 and 2020?
I think the first thing that kind of happens during this period of time is if you look at 2016, it's kind of a growth. And then Donald Trump is elected in 2016, at the end of 2016. I think this kind of leads to this lull, right? I think that there's other movements that are going on, and a lot of the actors who are involved in these other movements would be involved in Black Lives Matter. So one of the things that quickly happens after Donald Trump's election is you have a women's march movement, and then not about a year after that, you have March for Our Lives, which has to do with gun violence. So I think a lot of these actors are trying to put out, I would say, multiple fires in their view. And so there's a lot of movement between these actors across movements. And so I think that accounts for part of that lull. I think George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery was kind of a reminder that, hey, the Black Lives Matter movement of 2016 hadn't fully completed its goals, right? Numerous states have put in dash cams, but this didn't seem to be changing behavior. And so there was a return to this movement because of the recent spark of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Sean Reed, George Floyd.
Mm-hmm. All right, yeah, thank you. A couple of the questions coming in, looks like Okay, so how might the Black Lives Matter movement impact election results for the November election nationally and in Oregon? I guess it's kind of more of a personal perspective.
Oh. Yeah, so this is basically, I think, so we know that when there's a large growth in protest activity, people who protest are much more likely to vote because the cost of protesting is so high, right? You have to go out, you have to find where a protest is, you have to go to the protest. There's a possibility of some type of violence happening against you as a protester. It's much more public. And so if you're someone dedicated enough to protest, you're going to be someone who's much more likely to vote. And so we can see this most recently in 2018 with the Women's March, right? People who are involved in the Women's March were much more likely to vote in the 2018 midterm elections. Young people who were involved with March for Our Lives were also more likely to vote. And so one of the impacts of this will be that you'll probably see a more diverse electorate in 2020 than we saw in 2016. And this tends to benefit the Democratic Party. And so assuming that these patterns hold, this movement will probably benefit the Democratic Party. Although it's possible if there's enough Republicans taking these issues too, that they could siphon off some of those votes. But that nationally is much rarer. It's mostly Democrats talking about Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, next one up, and I think most folks that have been attuned kind of with social justice mind frame, whether that's something that you gain through, I know for me, it was like you got it in college and it's like, wow, mind blown, awakened. But then we go to work and we go to our job. And that's not always the same case for everybody. We all come from different backgrounds. How do you recommend approaching conversations about bias specifically with people that outrank you in an organization? And maybe kind of related to how we do or don't talk about politics too.
Yeah, that's a real tricky situation, right? Like to identify bias. So people don't like to be told that they're biased, right? Like no boss wants to be told that they have a bias. But it is important in this recognition, right? I think different organizations have different channels to make those complaints. And I think that that's probably the proper way to go about it. I think it's also just possible to say, like, this is a systematic problem. I think one of the things about racial bias is there's a belief that it's a personal and a unique problem to the individual, right? So you feel attacked if you're the only one that's racially biased. But to bring up the idea that, this is something that humans cognitively do. And so if we're not aware of it and we're not checking ourselves, then it's going to happen, right? Like no matter what, people have, and it's how we're wired as humans to have certain preferences. And generally people have in-group preferences. So I think making people aware that in general, people have these in-group preferences. And the only way to address it is to really check yourself and to think about the actions that you take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so commenting related to what you were just talking about around kind of the atmosphere that protests can bring up around political parties. What about some of the way the question's worded? What about some of the impacts of all the upcoming evictions on people's ability to vote?
Oh yeah, obviously that's going to be huge, right? And if depending on the state that you're in, there's obviously incentives to get those people to vote, to make it easier for those individuals to vote. Because that group of voters is probably going to be one party more than another. In other states, it's going to try to make it harder. COVID has really kind of thrown a wrench into what we know about American politics. And I don't envy pollsters right now trying to have to predict what the electorate's going to look like in 2020. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's going to have a large effect because I think a lot of the people that are being evicted, obviously people who have less resources don't have a lot of time to be thinking about politics, right? You're thinking about the food, putting food on your table. You're thinking about being sheltered. And so this could, I think, have a large effect if governments, state governments, federal governments don't step in to change things. Yeah.
Excellent. And then, so kind of related to that, talking about policies a little bit. So what are the systematic policy solutions that you think can solve racial inequalities in healthcare, education, housing, and wealth? That's pretty broad. So feel free to take us up, but maybe what might some of those solutions look like?
So I think there has to be proactive stances, right? So people have to be proactive in the positions that they take. And the simple answer is really just funding, right? Like we saw a real large decrease in racial inequality during the 1970s and early 1980s, in large part because the federal government was spending so much money to address it, right? So if all schools have a lot of money, then it's a lot easier for education inequalities to be addressed. If the healthcare system is affordable for everyone, then you're going to address some of these inequalities. So I think it really is funding, right? And that's kind of hard in a period of time where funding is tight, but that's probably a quick fix. The other thing, and I know this is really unpopular, is just collecting data, right? So I think there's a big pushback against collecting data on anything, right? Because if you collect data, then it becomes clear that there's a problem that needs to be addressed. And so collecting data and understanding where disparities are occurring can help policymakers put into practice policies which can address these things. I don't know that there is one magic bullet. I mean, the closest thing to a magic bullet would probably just be funding, right? And I hesitate to say this, but I do think it matters, is like some type of affirmative action program. Some programs that say, look, if you have two people that are equal, you might have to think about the racial makeup of your school, because I think people's most unconscious bias is to preference their in group, right? I think that's just the way it is. And people in power tend to be disproportionately white. So if they have two people that are equal, they're going to choose the person that's closest to their in group, who's most likely going to be white. And that's going to lead to more African Americans being disenfranchised. Whereas if you put some type of affirmative action in policy in practice, then that in-group bias might be better addressed.
Okay. And then, so another one coming up, actually a couple different questions on this one related to the same idea. How would you respond to those who claim the Black Lives Movement is actually a Marxist movement exploiting George Floyd's murder and masquerading as a racial equality campaign?
I would say, I'm not, that sounds more like it's a deeper, it seems, I don't want to say conspiratorial, but it's like kind of it sounds more like a conspiracy theory to me. And I don't know that it's that deep, right? Like, I think there is this problem, and this is a problem that's happened forever, right? So I showed videos of this being a problem in the 1990s. The data that we have show this is a problem in the 1990s. It's not, and I think it's also mistaken, right? So Marx wouldn't be a big proponent of racial equality. He would say that race and racial problems are problems that just distract from class inequality. So at the end of the day, Marxists would largely believe that race isn't a problem, right? That's just one step to really addressing class inequality. So being a Marxist idea is totally wrong. That those things don't fit together. But I also don't think that's the case. Do I think that people are taking these sparks, these moments in time to try to push for actual change? Certainly. I think all social movements do this, right? If there's a crucial moment, people want to bring attention to these problems, and they often use these types of cases. So the murder of Emmett Till in the 1950s was used to really look at the kind of violence that people of color and Blacks face in the South, to start really get more people involved in a movement to address racial inequality.
Okay. Yeah, another question. You talked a little bit about funding just being kind of a baseline thing, that as funding for certain programs increase, you have that potential attainment of equity in certain areas. But looking at that, since the framework around this idea of dismantling police forces and using these resources to fund social services, I guess, is there a kind of a teeter-totter effect of, like, you take too much away and it hurts the system? Kind of what's your take on that concept of defunding those police forces for that effort?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. It's kind of one of the great things about living in a federalist system, where we can have like little laboratories across the United States to see what policies work and what policies don't work. I do think that there's an interesting sociology study that I read recently. It was about police in San Francisco, and basically they were called to do things that they otherwise wouldn't have wanted to do, right? And it had to do with dealing with the homeless population, because these people weren't committing a crime, but business owners would say they were a public nuisance. And so where police officers would often overlook those problems, they were kind of called out to have to deal with them. And so I think it might actually be good for police departments to have people that are trained in social service to actually address these problems. And so diverting funds might not necessarily be a bad thing, because then police can work on police work, right? They don't have to worry about dealing with domestic disputes. They can go solve murders, or they can go prevent crimes from happening. And so in some ways it might be better, but my thoughts are it might be better, but we need to see the empirical results. So we need to see across the cities how this actually works out.
Sorry, I had a little cough there.
That's right.
Okay, so a couple other ones. Interesting question. So Black Lives Matter seems to be a grassroots movement without necessarily a clear, distinct, singular leader. Do you think that limits or enhances its impact?
Both, right? So so this is the really difficult thing about Black Lives Matter, and I think movements that are leaderless in general, is that during the civil rights movement, you would have protests, you would have, so both the March to Selma and then marches in Birmingham led to national crises and changes in public opinion. So when members of Congress and the president wanted to speak to leaders, they knew these are the leaders of CORE, these are the leaders of the of SNCC, these are the leaders of the Southern SCLC. So you could bring in Martin Luther King, you could bring in Farmer, you could bring in Stokely Carmichael, and you can bring in leaders and say, what do I need to address these problems? And those leaders could speak for the organization. So it's a lot clearer. It was clear about what policies would come out of it. One of the things that's hard about Black Lives Matter, of course, you have the three women who started the movement, but they themselves advocate for kind of a leadership, a leaderless organization where every different city has their own passions. So the disadvantage, of course, is that it's harder for policymakers to know what the movement wants because the movement is so amorphous. I think a good parallel to this would be Occupy Wall Street in the early 2010s, where it was a leaderless organization, and so it was harder to translate some of their policies, preferences into action. But there is an advantage to being leaderless and having more of a loose organization, and that is that organizations at the local level can address problems that are important to people in that locality, right? So if people in Corvallis are worried about a particular issue, the Black Lives Matter movement can focus on that issue. Where let's say voting rights is the issue that Black Lives Matter as a group is focused on. Maybe that's not an issue that matters here in Corvallis. And so it's harder to drum up support. And so the organization can expand in that way. And going back to the idea of a federalist society is that because the organization is more loose, the different organizations can learn from each other, right? So because it's more decentralized, we can find out, hey, the Black Lives Matter organization in Eugene is able to get a lot of success with this type of message. And that can then be used in the Black Lives Matter in New York City, in Los Angeles, in Minneapolis, in a way where if it's a real centralized message, this is the message that goes down, you don't have that same variation.
Okay. Another question is, you mentioned COVID a little bit. Do you feel like, the nation, but the world, because of the circumstances behind COVID, that people have become more tuned in to political issues, whether they be BLM or other things? Or I guess what kind of a deeper impact do you think COVID has allowed the American public?
Well, I think COVID kind of intersects is one of the reasons why I think Black Lives Matter, there's a resurgence of Black Lives Matter in recent years, in large part because people are at home, right? People are paying attention to the news in a way that they wouldn't have been in January or February of this year. And the news cycle just moves so much quicker that it was hard for people to pay attention to it. But when everyone's at home, then it's a lot easier to get this information, and people have more time to look at the information and explore racial inequality much more deeply in a way that they hadn't in the past. And I know anecdotally, I've seen a couple of people who started a protest around Black Lives Matter, saying, look, I was at home, and it was only because I was at home that I really thought more deeply about this, and that's what motivated me to turn out. So I do think that the fact that people were at home for a long period of time did make the videos like the Ahmaud Arbery video and the George Floyd video more potent in starting the more recent resurgence of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, it's been interesting because even just on a personal note, I think sometimes, depending again, like our work circumstance, we spend most of our day at work, those of us that are working, and it's like, how often do you either have the opportunity or do you have the environment to be able to talk about things like this? So I think it's been even interesting having kids at home, talking with spouses, talking with partners, in a way that I don't know that I would have done that before, to be honest with you. Like, I hate to say that this is a silver lining thing with COVID, but it's like, there have been some deeper conversations, I think, for many of us who have chosen to kind of actively tune in to what's going on.
I think that's right. I think there's going to be such interesting research that comes out of this. Because I think people are at home now. And so I think because of COVID and because